ever feel like when things get built around you, it's kind of a mystery? Like why there?
Yeah.
Why there and not over there? Well, today we're diving into Estonian spatial planning. We're going to see how a country tries to wrangle all those different opinions and interests when it
Yeah.
comes to literally shaping their country.
Yeah.
And I think their experience might give us a new perspective on our own communities.
Yeah, you know what I think is so fascinating about the Estonian case is that they've got 25 years
Okay.
of planning experience,
Yeah.
which they've condensed into this green book, which is really
Oh,
fascinating. And it's really honest about the challenges.
okay.
It's not just like, oh, look how great we are. It's like, oh no,
Yeah.
here are all the things that we've been struggling with and continue to struggle with.
Okay, so let's unpack this agreement. First things first.
Okay.
How does Estonian planning actually work?
Okay, so Estonian planning is actually surprisingly decentralized. So unlike, some countries where it's very top-down, like the national government
Right.
kind of sets the rules and then it trickles down, Estonia gives a lot of power
Wow.
to the municipality. So imagine your local council
Yeah.
having a really strong say in decisions that are made about national development.
So if you're used to a top-down approach,
Yeah,
Estonia is flip the script.
totally. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a very different approach.
Wow. Okay. So what does that mean for a practical example? Let's say there's a developer who wants to build a new apartment complex.
Right.
What happens?
So this is where the Green Book gets into these two kind of key concepts. One is what they call ad hoc planning,
Okay.
and the other is strategic planning.
Okay.
And you can almost think about it like this. Ad hoc planning is kind of like the reactive stuff, right?
Okay.
So somebody wants to build that apartment complex. That triggers a planning process.
Okay.
Strategic planning is much more long-term.
Okay.
It sets the ground rules for land use.
So strategic is we're deciding, is this a forest or a desert?
Exactly, yeah.
And ad hoc is well,
Are we planting a tree?
yeah, replanting a tree.
Exactly.
Okay.
And one of the things that the Green Book highlights, I think, really well is that even a project that seems straightforward, like an apartment complex, might require a whole separate ad hoc plan
Wow.
just to kind of navigate the complexities of the regulations in Estonia.
Yeah.
They even include this really helpful table
Oh.
that kind of contrasts the two. And I think it really drives the point home.
So you're telling me that in Estonia, to build something, you might need a plan for your plan?
Sometimes, yes,
Oh.
absolutely.
Oh.
And that reflects, I think, how deeply Estonians feel about land and how those values kind of permeate the entire system.
Oh, that's where it gets really interesting because everyone's got an opinion about land,
Right.
especially when it's in their backyard, right?
Mhm.
So how does Estonia handle that push and pull,
Yeah.
what individuals want versus maybe what's better for the country as a whole? How do they balance that?
Yeah, and that's where I think we get into this really fascinating clash between public and private interests.
So how do they balance that?
Yeah.
With everybody
Well, and that's
having these strong opinions.
where I think the Green Book is really interesting.
Okay.
Because they come right out and they say Estonians feel a sense of ownership
Okay.
over their surroundings. And that creates a real challenge for planners.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to make these decisions about land use
Right.
when everybody feels like they're a stakeholder.
Yeah, it's like designing a park when everybody wants to plant different flowers, you
Right.
know?
Totally, yeah.
So how do they actually approach this public engagement piece? Do they have town halls? What do they do?
So they've tried different things, and the Green Book actually talks about some of the paradoxes
Okay.
they've encountered, which I think is really interesting. Like, for example, they found that even though people care deeply about the land,
Right.
sometimes public meetings about these major projects
Right.
would be very poorly attended.
Really?
Yeah.
That's so interesting. I would think if people cared so much,
You
they would want to show up to be counted, right?
Yeah, and that's something that the Green Book kind of grapples with.
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily come up with a clear answer,
Right.
but they say is it apathy? Is it resignation?
Yeah.
Do people just feel like their voices aren't going to be heard?
Or they don't. They don't know. They don't know how to even participate, right?
And how do you design a process
Yeah.
that brings those people in?
Yeah, because that happens all the time.
Totally.
Everybody's got an opinion about the local park,
Right.
but how many people show up to the actual meeting, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's a challenge that you see
Right.
across the board.
Okay.
in plan-
So if they're dealing with that silent majority, the people who don't show up,
Yeah.
how do you balance that? How do you even know?
Well, and then it gets even more complicated, right? Because the Green Book talks about how sometimes, even with really well-intentioned plans,
Right.
they can be really open to interpretation.
Okay.
Like there's vagueness.
Vague plans.
Yeah. So they give this really interesting example about this rule in Estonia that you have to have a 50-meter setback for development from certain natural features.
Okay.
Sounds simple enough.
Right. 50 meters.
50 meters.
Okay.
But even the courts were struggling to figure out, like, how do you actually apply that
Wow.
in practice?
So even with a rule, like
Yes.
a seemingly clear rule,
Right.
it still gets down to interpretation.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important takeaway for anybody who's trying to understand planning,
Yeah.
not just in Estonia, but anywhere.
Yeah.
That these are complex systems, and what we're really talking about is trying to take these social values and these ideas about the environment
Right.
and translate that into concrete actions.
Yeah, it's not just lines on a map.
It's
It's people's lives.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the people who have to actually make these plans, the planners themselves, they have a really tough job.
Yeah.
So what does the Green Book say about the role of planners in all this? So the planners are the ones who kind of have to make sense of all this.
Yeah.
But you said that the Green Book doesn't hold back on, like, criticizing how they've been doing.
Yeah, they're surprisingly.
What are some of the challenges that they highlight?
Frank, like, they talk about this skills gap
Okay.
that exists, like, within the planning world.
Interesting.
They're basically saying that, like, planning in Estonia today, it's not just about, like, zoning maps and permits.
Right.
It's about understanding the law.
Right.
It's about social dynamics.
Right.
Thinking about the long-term consequences of decisions. And those aren't necessarily skills that every planner has.
Right. So it's not enough to just be good at, like,
Right.
drawing lines on a map.
Exactly.
To be, like, a
It's much more,
psychologist, a lawyer.
yeah, you need, like, a much broader toolkit.
Wow.
And they talk about the need for specialists
Okay.
from all different fields.
Okay.
Like, obviously, you need architects and engineers. You need environmental scientists. But you also need people who understand social and economic impacts.
Wow.
Like, they give this example about
Right.
how important it is to think about, for example,
Yeah.
access to kindergartens
Okay.
when you're planning a new development.
I never would have thought about that, but yeah.
Or transportation. Right. Like, how are people going to get around?
Right.
And even the potential for, like, social exclusion.
Wow.
Like, if you don't plan these things carefully.
Right. You could accidentally create a community where people are isolated.
Exactly.
Wow.
So it's about thinking about the people
yeah.
who are going to be living and working in these spaces.
Not just the buildings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And all that complexity
Right.
brings us to another question,
Okay.
which is, who pays for this?
Right. Because that level of expertise doesn't come cheap.
Exactly. And the Green Book actually
Yeah.
raises some concerns
Yeah.
about how a lot of the planning in Estonia
Yeah.
is paid for by the developers themselves.
But isn't that kind of how it works a lot of places? Like,
Yeah, it's a common model.
the developer proposes the project and then they pay for
Right.
the planning costs. Right.
But what the Green Book is saying is like,
Yeah. What's the problem with that?
well, hold on.
Okay.
Think about the implications of that.
Okay.
If the developer is the one footing the bill,
Yeah.
doesn't that create a potential conflict of interest?
Oh, because they might say, like, well,
Yeah.
we're not going to pay for all those studies.
We'll pay for the traffic study,
Right.
but we're not going to pay for the social impact study.
Right, right.
You see what I mean?
Yeah, it's like whose
Yeah.
interests are actually being served.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, I never thought about that.
So the Green Book doesn't necessarily offer like here's the solution, but they're highlighting attention
Yeah, a real problem.
in this system.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about the challenges of balancing all these different views.
Right.
The complexities of planning. Like, it's not just lines on a map.
Yeah.
And this idea that you need
money.
money
To do well.
to do it well.
Right.
But how does this all translate into, like, actual change?
Right.
Like, are these plans actually achieving what they set out to do?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
And one of the things that the Green Book is actually quite critical of
Okay.
is that there's not enough evaluation
Interesting.
of the planning process itself.
So they're saying, like, we've made all these plans,
We make all these plans.
but we're not actually going back and looking at,
Did they work?
did they work?
Like, what were the outcomes?
Interesting.
And I think that's something that,
It's like making a recipe and then
yeah,
never tasting it.
exactly.
Yeah.
And how can you improve if you're not
Right.
actually looking at the results?
Right. And I think that actually is a good way to sum up this whole thing, because it's like
Yeah,
creating a plan is just the first step.
right.
Yes.
It's an ongoing process.
You have to be willing to revisit it.
Absolutely.
Be flexible, change, adapt.
It's like that tapestry that
Yeah.
we were talking about.
Yeah, the Estonian landscape.
You're constantly weaving and reweaving.
Yeah, Estonian planning is a journey, not a destination, right?
Exactly.
It's constantly evolving.
And I think what's really interesting is
Yeah,
the Green Book is very much focused on Estonia,
right.
but these lessons
Yeah,
are applicable
yeah.
to anyone
To any community.
who's dealing with these issues of like, how do we shape our spaces?
It all comes down to people in the end, right?
It really does.
Like understanding people's values and trying to find common ground.
And I think that's a nice
Yeah.
place to kind of,
Yeah, this has been a great deep dive. I
Yeah.
feel like I've learned a lot
Yeah.
about Estonia, but also just about my own community and how these decisions get made.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.